All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Av, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in honor of their grandchildren, Tikva Esther, Simcha, Avigayil, Milana and Milicenta. May they grow to become the best version of themselves. The Daf Yomi share in the schus of refuah shlema for Yehuda Ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Jeff and Karen Cohn, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Karen's mother, Clara Oxman. We hope that on the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the neshamos have an aliyah, the families in nechama, and all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. So with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Beis 42. We are picking up on Mem Aleph on Mem Beis, just a few lines shy of the end of the parak. And we left off, let's pick up with, right before the parak ends, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 12 lines up before the parak ends. So let's remember again, we ended off yesterday with a very important conclusion, with the Gemara telling us that Chatzi Nezek, half damages, is in fact a knas. Remember again, that was the machlokas. That was the dispute that we were really hyper-focused on throughout yesterday's daf. Is the half, remember again, Chatzi Nezek is paid in a situation when my ox is a first-time offender. So my ox scores Ruvain's ox, again, first-time offender, halacha l'maisa, the halacha tells me that I pay Chatzi Nezek, half damages. Ultimately, again, is that a monetary payment or is it a penalty payment? Is it mamon or is it knas? And remember again, based on yesterday's daf, we saw what's the nafkamina, what's the practical difference if it's mamon or knas? What's the nafkamina? Can you pay based on your own admission? Remember again, if it's knas, the concept of knas that we saw also in yesterday's daf, very important principle. By the way, I want to point out, this is why Kesuvos is called shas katan. Kesuvos is called the mini shas because the truth is, there are so many Talmudic concepts embedded in this one Gemara. You just look at yesterday's daf. So again, we've got the concept of modeh b'knas pater, that if you admit that you're obligated to a penalty payment, you are pater. You are pater. That's based on the Agzeres Akasa. That's based on a pasuk. Right? Now again, so therefore, whether or not Chatzi Nezek is knas or mamon is incredibly important. It's not just like an academic classification. At the end of the day, whether or not it's knas or mamon will drive whether or not I could self-incriminate. So we go back and forth, but halacha l'maisa, the Gemara ended off, this is what we ended off with in yesterday's daf, is that Chatzi Nezek, half damages, which is the payment paid for a first-time offending ox, is knas, is penalty, is a penalty payment, and therefore halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, if I go ahead and admit it of my own volition, I am pater. As a result of that, the Gemara says, "V'hashta da'amrit palginiska knasa." Now that we've established that Chatzi Nezek is a knas, hai kalba da'achel imri. This is interesting. A dog that eats a sheep. Now, if you look at Rashi says something interesting. Da'achel imri shechanak talaim chayim ba'achlam. If you have a dog that strangled the sheep and ate the sheep, or we'll see why this case is important in just a moment, or shunra da'achal tarnagoli ravravi, or you have a cat that ate a very large chicken, or a very large rooster. Rashi says over here, not yet. What's the halacha? Mishunahi. Now we'll say, these are considered to be abnormal cases. If you take a look at Rashi, mishunahu, ein darka b'kach. Apparently dogs don't strangle sheep, and cats, when they attack chickens or roosters, will attack smaller ones, not larger ones. So I will say, again, these are Baba Kama concepts over here. This is called a deviant act of damages, right? Deviant damages. If you look at Rashi, mishunahu ein darka b'kach. A dog doesn't damage in this way. A cat doesn't damage in this way. Now, why is this important? The chol nezek mishunahu behema. We'll say any time an animal damages in an abnormal fashion, have tolda de Karen tama. Sha'af hu mishuna de ein darka b'kach v'chatzi nezek hu de mishalim. So we'll say, okay, so just one more piece of avakam over here. There's a concept of Karen. An animal damages in different ways. So, for example, we saw yesterday the concept of regel. Regel means when an animal causes damage just in the course of its activities of daily living. There's no aggressive behavior. Remember again, we saw in yesterday's daf, the animal is walking, kicks up pebbles, the pebbles go ahead and damage someone else's utensil. So that's called tsroros de regel. But the idea is the animal's just walking, the animal's minding its own business, but it caused damage. Karen refers to aggressive animal behaviors which cause damage. So I will say, here you have a case of Karen Mishuna, where the animal is damaging, but the animal is damaging in an abnormal way. A dog doesn't normally strangle a sheep. A cat doesn't normally attack large roosters or chickens. So here it's an aggressive act, that's called Karen, but it's abnormal. So okay, without getting into all the details, but abnormal Karen is kind of treated in halacha like a first-time offending goring ox, right? And therefore halacha l'maisa, subject to chatzi nezek. Okay, subject to chatzi nezek. So we'll say, so you're going to see why the Gemara is bringing up this case. So this is a case over here of halacha l'maisa, where I'm going to be chayiv. It's really a fascinating case. I'm chayiv chatzi nezek. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, v'lo magbinam bebavel, and we would not collect such damages in Bavel. And I will say, why not? This is incredible. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, actually not yet, sorry. Aval Zutre, again, we'll see what we'll say. In Bavel, they collected mamon, they didn't collect knas. Meaning what? And this is really quite fascinating, that knas, we're going to see, requires a beis din that has smicha. Smicha is an unbroken chain of ordination going back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Without formal smicha, a beis din can collect mamon. They can collect monetary compensation. They can't collect knas. So the Gemara says, however, aval zutri orchehu, but if a dog kills, right, the dog kills a sheep in a normal way, or the cat goes ahead and kills a chicken or a rooster that's smaller, that's normal, umagbinon. And ultimately, again, such damages you can collect even in Batei Din in Bavel. Apparently, the courts in Bavel did not have dayanim who had smicha. They were talmidei chachamim, but they didn't have this formal smicha. Therefore, in Bavel, they could not collect knas. Pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. Rashi, if you look at Rashi, by the way, Rashi says, it's the first wide line in Rashi, middle of the line, v'chevon deknasahu lo magbina le b'dayane Bavel. So because it's a knas, you can't collect this with dayanim in Bavel. She'ein sham smicha b'zikenim. V'lo mikru mumchim. V'gabe knas ksiv yashin alakim. Okay, I will say, we're not going to get into these technicalities right now, but the Gemara sensitizes us to this idea that you could only collect knas with a beis din that has smicha. So in Bavel, the Batei Din did not have normative smicha, regular smicha, or I should say classic smicha. Therefore, they couldn't collect knas payments, but they could collect mamon. So the Gemara says, however, v'itafas lo mafkinon minei. Listen, this is actually fascinating. There's a concept in halacha sometimes that a beis din can't enforce a particular claim, but if the claimant seizes property, right? Let's say the plaintiff seizes property of the defendant, beis din would not extract that property. So just to illustrate this over here, let's play this out. My dog goes ahead and chokes. Right? My cat attacks Ruben's large chicken. That's mishuna. That's considered to be deviant behavior. Now, what kind of deviant behavior? As we saw before, it's Karen Mishuna. What's the halacha for Karen Mishuna? Chatzi nezek. Chatzi nezek is a knas. Good. Chatzi nezek is knas. Because it's knas, therefore what? It cannot be collected in Bavel. It's incredible. Why can't it be collected in Bavel? Because in Bavel, they didn't have smicha. And you can only collect knas with smicha. Suppose we have an interesting case over here. Everyone knows my chicken did it. My cat did it. Right? Everyone knows my cat did it. Beis din is just simply powerless to go ahead and enforce this knas. Well, if Ruvain were to come over to my house, come into my garage, and take my snowblower, because this was his prize, fair winning chicken. He brought this chicken to the fair every year. And this one, and the chicken was worth $500. So he takes my snowblower, which is worth $5,000. If I say 5,500, whatever it is, but he takes my snowblower, which is the same amount of money. Beis Din would not extract the snowblower from Reuven. Interesting case, because Beis Din knows that Reuven is entitled to it. But Lamaisa, they're powerless to go and enforce this claim because they don't have smicha. Okay. V'i amar ekavali zimna le'eretz Yisrael. And I will say, if Reuven were to say, listen, fine, so let's make a court date in Eretz Yisrael. We'll go to Eretz Yisraal, because in Eretz Yisrael, the Batei Din there had, the Dayarim have smicha, and they'll be able to enforce the knas. Then mekav way. Then we make a time, in other words, then Beis Din will force me, the defendant, to go ahead and go up to Eretz Yisrael to have the case heard there. I will say, since in Bavel, we can't adjudicate this properly, if the plaintiff says, I want to go to Eretz Yisrael to have the case heard, Beis Din will force me, the defendant, to go to Eretz Yisrael. I will say, Rabbi Nachman says on this statement something so beautiful. He says that there's a deeper meaning in this phrase. V'amar ikavali zimna le'eretz Yisrael. If a Jew says, I need to get to Eretz Yisrael. If a Jew says, I need to have my time to get to Eretz Yisrael. The Rebbe is not talking about for a visit. He's not talking about for a vacation. But if a Jew feels in his heart that my place is in Eretz Yisrael, my place is there. Ikavali zimna le'eretz. I need to establish my time where I could build my life in Eretz Yisrael. Mikavino lei. Ultimately, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will help him get there. If the Jew truly desires to truly be in Eretz Yisrael with all of his essence, to make his kaviyos there, kaviyos means like an established permanent presence, to make his kaviyos there, ikavale. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give him the siyata d'shmaya to make that happen. It's a beautiful idea. V'ilo azil. And again, if the defendant refuses to go to Eretz Yisrael, ultimately we excommunicate him. Benkach mishantin. That is very interesting. The truth is, we excommunicate him either way. Why? The amin alei salik hezekach. Because they will say, here's the problem. In both of these cases, what's the problem? I'm maintaining a vicious dog, or I'm maintaining a vicious cat. And the halacha is that Beis Din puts pressure on a person to not possess things which could damage other people. Midi Rabbi Nosson. So Rabbi Nosson, the son of Rabbi Nosson, Omer minayin shlo yigad adam kelev rabbisov beiso. How do we know that a person should not raise a bad dog in their home? In other words, they will say that a person shouldn't raise an animal that has the ability to do damage to others in their home. Similarly, below ya'amid sulam ra'ua b'soch beiso, or a person should not go ahead and maintain a rickety ladder. A rickety ladder is a ladder that could collapse if somebody tries to scale it. How do you know this? Shne'emar v'lo sasim damim b'veisecha. Because the pasuk says, do not let there be blood in your home. In other words, the both say, so what the Gemara is saying over here is, there's like multiple levels over here, right? So if it's because it's chatzi nezek, therefore it's a knas. Beis Din in Bavel, who doesn't have smicha, can't hear the case. Okay, but if Reuven ends up seizing some of my property to satisfy his loss, Beis Din will not extract it from him. And if Reuven says, "Make me a court date in Eretz Yisrael," Beis Din will force me to go. And if I don't go, Beis Din excommunicates me. And then the Gemara says, by the way, Beis Din is going to excommunicate me regardless, until I remedy the issue. And what's ultimately, again, remedying the issue? What's remedying the issue? Remedying the issue is removing the source of danger. So whether it's the vicious dog, the violent cat, or the rickety ladder, Beis Din orders me ultimately to go ahead and remove that. I will say there's a beautiful piece on Minayin Shlo Yigad Adam Kelevra, but we'll save it, we'll get a little bit further in the daf, and then we'll come back in Meretz Hashem and do that. Hadrin Aloch, Elu Nara, Sabosai, Shkoyach. Mazel Tov. Nara Shinis Pasasa. Shabosai, a girl who was seduced. Boshka Upagamo Kunasa Shalavia. So remember, we've established this already. Her boshes, humiliation, Pagam depreciation, Knas is the penalty payment, belongs to her father. Vahatsar bitfusa. And ultimately we'll say, now again, if there's tsar, now remember, when is there tsar? Tsar doesn't apply in the case of mafuta, right? There's no tsar in seduction. Tsar is only by ones. So the Mishnah just says, by the way, and if there's tsar, i.e. a case of ones, that goes to her father. Okay. Amda bedin. I both say, now we get into some of the interesting cases here. Amda bedin. So I will say, let's say now again, Ruvain seduced Rachel. And now what happens? So there's a court proceedings. Remember again, this is a din Torah. Because Bepashtos, Reuven is not admitting to what it is that he did. So Amda bedin, if ultimately they began the court proceedings, Ad Shalom Sa'av. So let's say they began the court proceedings, the father is still alive, Harehin Shalav. So as we just said before, all of the financial awards, so to speak, that Beis Din awards Rachel really go to her father. Meisa'av, what happens if halacha l'maisa, the father dies? Harehin shel achim. Ultimately, again, then the awards, so to speak, go to her brothers. And I will say what that means is if the father dies, then halacha l'maisa, the money that he would have been entitled to passes on to his heirs as inheritance. So assuming that she has brothers, these financial awards of Boshes, Pegam, Knas, ultimately again will go on to her brothers. Okay. Lo ispika la'amod b'din ad shemei sa'av. So this is an interesting case. We'll say what happens if halacha l'maisa, right? Reuven violates Rachel or seduces Rachel, whichever case it is, and they're going to take the case to Beis Din. But before the case comes to Beis Din, so Rachel's father dies. So lo ispika la'amod b'din ad shemei sa'av harehin shalatzma. In that case, then halacha l'maisa, the girl keeps all of the money, right? Rachel gets all of the financial settlement. Look at Rashi. Lo hispika la'amod b'din. Rashi says, third to last line from the bottom. Kibun lo amda b'din lav mamonhu. See, I will say, since the court proceedings did not begin, the award is not considered to belong to the father. Lahorisha labana. See, I will say, here's what's interesting. It seems to be from the Mishnah that if the court proceedings began and the father died after they had begun, so we view the awards as already having belonged to the father before he died, and therefore they'll pass through to the inheritors. However, if the father died before the court proceedings began, then the father really has no rights in that money. Because he has no rights in the money, they don't pass through to the inheritors. So where does the money go? The money remains with Rachel. Good. Another interesting case. Let's say halacha l'maisa, they begin the court proceedings before she becomes a bogeres. Harehin shalav. Then ultimately the awards will go to the father. Meis ha'av, if the father dies. Harehin shalachin. Then ultimately they'll pass through to the inheritors. Lo ispika la'amod b'din ad shebagra. Harehin shalatzma. Now, both this last case is very interesting. We've actually alluded to this already. Right? Reuven violates Rachel. Obviously, again, in order for there to be a knas, right? What stage is Rachel in? What is she in? She's a nara. So now let's say also by the time the Beis Din gets a chance to hear the case, she's what? She's a bogeres. So in that case, the award belongs to her. She's a bogeres already. So I will say it's actually very interesting. Rabbi Shimon has a different model. So I will say, up until now, the Tanakama of the Mishnah understands that as long as the legal proceedings began and the father was alive, any financial settlements belong to who? The father. So that even if the father died before the verdict was delivered, the awards are considered to belong to the father, and then they'll pass through to the inheritors. Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Rabbi Shimon says, Im lo hispika ligbos ad shemei sa'av harehin shalatzma. So it's very interesting. Rabbi Shimon says the only time that the awards from Beis Din belong to the father is when he actually had possession of them, when he collected them. But halacha l'maisa, even if the father was alive for the proceedings, and even if the father was alive for the verdict, if the father did not collect the money is not his. And because it's not his, it doesn't pass through to the inheritors upon his death. Rather, again, if he dies before actual collection, who gets the money? Rachel. Rashi says over here, last Rashi in the Daf, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Afal pi sha'am debedin, lo habi mamon da'av, lo horisha labanav, ademati liyadei. So we'll say this is the position of Rabbi Shimon. The money, the awards, does not belong to the father until the father actually collects it. So if the father dies any time before collection, the money belongs to Rachel and does not pass through to the inheritor. So we'll say a fundamental machlokes. So again, I just want to point out once more what this machlokes is, because this is dramatic. So you've got the Tanakama saying that the only time the money, there will be two cases where the money will belong to her, according to the Tanakama. Case number one is where she becomes a bogeres even before the court proceedings begin, which makes sense. And case number two is where the father died before the court proceedings began. But essentially, if the father is alive at the time the court proceedings begin, even if he dies before the verdict, the money is considered, the award, we'll call it, the awards are considered to be the possession of the father. Now the father's dead, so what'll happen? It'll pass through, the Mishnah calls it, to her brothers, meaning it'll pass through to the father's inheritors. Rabbi Shimon says, no, the money only belongs to the father when it actually comes into his possession. If the father doesn't take possession, so it doesn't matter when he died, if he didn't take possession, the money's not his. So if he dies any time before he actually takes possession, so in other words, let's say the Beis Din delivered the verdict, but ultimately, again, he just didn't take possession, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Shimon will say it belongs to the girl, belongs to Rachel. Top of Membeis, Rabbi say, top of Membeis. So the Gemara said, Maisi Adem Mitziyasa Afa Bishal Gavsa Meisa Av Harin Shal Achin. Her earnings, that's Maisi Adem, her earnings, Mitziyasa, that which she finds, we'll see exactly what that case is. Afa Bishal Gavsa, even though they have not yet been collected, Meisa Av Harin Shal Achin. So we'll say, this case, what the Gemara seems to be saying is like this, that halacha l'maisa, if you have a situation where she earned money during her father's lifetime. Now remember again, her earnings technically belong to her father. So if she earned money during her father's lifetime, even though she didn't yet collect it, those are considered to be the possession of the father, and therefore again, when the father dies, those earnings will pass through to the heirs. Okay, so we'll say, we'll analyze those cases separately. So my kamashwan, so we'll say, so here's the problem. The opening part of the Mishnah seems to be totally redundant. We've learned this already. Namely, what does the opening part of the Mishnah say? It says that a girl who is seduced, her boshes, pegam, and kanas go to her father. So the Gemara says, "My kamash malon." What's the chiddush in that? Tanina, we've learned this already. Hamefate nosin shlosha dvarim. Right, the seducer pays three buckets of money. Right, three things. Va'ones arba, and the violator pays 4. Hamefate nosin boshes upegamu kanas. So ultimately, the seducer pays boshes, pegam, and kanas. Mosif alav ones. Ultimately, again, the ones will pay one more item. Shenosin esatzar. And right, and also, so why does the Mishnah need to go ahead and repeat this concept? To which the Gemara says, la'aviyah it's darachle. No, the Mishnah needs to tell me that you pay it to the father. Pay it to the father, la'aviyah nami pshita. We learned that already also, that you pay it to the father. Midikayoyev mifata. Now, I'll say, here's what's interesting. This is fascinating. It's obvious that these payments are made to the father. How do you know they're made to the father, Rabbi say? The case of mefata teaches me that this is made to the father. Why? Because Rabbi said, if it wasn't made to the father, there should be no payments for mefata. Why should there be no payments for mefata? Why not? Because it's consensual. In other words, Rabbi said, I know it sounds very strange to us about consensual with a girl who's 12 and a half years old, right? They're 12 years old. Doesn't make it, all right. But again, obviously, we've said this a million times already. The Gemara is obviously just operating with a fundamentally different societal model. But the point the Gemara is making over here is, this obvious that the payments go to the father, because if it's going to her, in the case of mefata, why should she be entitled to anything? This was a consensual act, to which the Gemara says, so we'll say, no, you're right. The entire point of the Mishnah, say essentially, the entire beginning of the Mishnah was really redundant, and it really was. I shouldn't say redundant. It was an introduction. What was it an introduction to? The case of Badin. They both say the meat of this Mishnah. The meat of this Mishnah is the machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and Tanakama as to when the father really becomes entitled to the awards of this particular case. So Badin itzrichalei. Plukta de Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. Really, what this Mishnah Rabbi says here to introduce us to is the machlokes Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan. Rabbi says, so once again, the Gemara now tells me the entire really first part of the Mishnah was really just an intro. What's the essence of this Mishnah? What's the meat of this Mishnah? The meat of this Mishnah Rabbi says is a machlokes of when a father becomes entitled to the compensation awarded to his daughter. When does a father become entitled? The Rabbanan say, as long as a father is alive at the beginning of the court proceedings, he is considered to be in possession, so to speak, of the awards. So that even if he dies before verdict, ultimately, again, those awards will pass through to his heirs. Rabbi Shimon says, no. Father is only in possession of the awards when he actually gets possession of it. Anytime beforehand, ultimately it'll belong to the Golik. The Gemara says that's the essence of this Mishnah. So let's analyze. So Tanan Hasan, we learned Anasto upasita as biti. But listen to this case, right? Reuven goes over to Shimon, and he says, Shimon, you went ahead, or I should say, Shimon goes over to Reuven, and he says, Reuven, you went ahead and you seduced or you violated my daughter. And Reuven says, no, I didn't. So Shimon, the father, now says, Mashbi acha ani, I want you to swear that you did not violate my daughter, you didn't seduce my daughter. Va'amar amen. And Reuven says amen, which means they both say what? Reuven takes a shvuah. Reuven swears that he did not go ahead and seduce Rachel, who is Shimon's daughter. The achar kach hoda, and then Reuven admits that he did. Right, that he did. So both say now two things have happened. What are the two things that have happened? Number one, Reuven seduced Rachel. That's number one. And number two, he took a false oath. He swore falsely. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Chayiv. Now, what are you chayiv here? Take a look at Rashi. Chayiv, it's in the short lines of Rashi, about 4 lines in Chayiv. Karen, so we'll say, he's chayiv Karen. I will say, in this case, what does Karen mean? Karen just means whatever regular monetary compensation. So I will say, let's say in a case of seduction, that's going to be the knas, boshes, and pegam. Right? Knas, boshes, pegam. So the Gemara says, so he's going to be chayiv. So that's Karen, v'chomesh. I will say, when you swear falsely, you're also chayiv a penalty fifth, an additional fifth, right? So there's chomesh, v'asham, and a carbon asham, right? And a carbon asham. So I will say asham gzelos, Rashi says. So these are the 3 things you're going to be chayiv. Number 1, well, let's work backwards. An asham gzelos, right? An asham gzelos. Number 2, Karen, which means all of the buckets of payment, plus chomesh, an additional penalty fifth. Rabbi Shimon poter. Rabbi Shimon says you're pater. Why does Rabbi Shimon say you're pater? Sheinu m'shalem knas al pi atzmo. Rabbi Shimon says because halacha l'maisa, this is a case of seduction. And remember, seduction has knas. And even though now Reuven's admitting that he lied, that he swore falsely, he's admitting that he owes a knas. They will say, what's the halacha when you admit, what's the halacha mode of the knas when you admit that you owe a knas? What's the halacha? Pater. This is yesterday's daf. Mode of the knas, pater. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon says he's pater from everything. There's no asham gzelos, there's no karen, there's no chomesh, there's no nothing. So it's pretty incredible. Rashi says over Sheinu m'shalem knas al pi atzmo, ela al pi edim, v'kevan de'ilu odi leikaman kishatavu, hava miftar ki karfrei nami ein shibuas kfiras mammon. Rabbi Shimon says, since if Reuven were to admit this whole thing of his own volition, he would be pater. Therefore, even in this case over here, halacha l'maisa, when he goes ahead and he swears falsely, and then he admits that he swore falsely, he's going to be pater as well. Amru lo, afal pi sheinu m'shalem knas al pi atzmo, aval m'shalem boshes ubegam al pi atzmo. So listen to this. So the Rabbanan said back to Rabbi Shimon, okay, but knas is only one part of this. In other words, knas is only one part of this penalty payment. It's only one part of this payment. There's also mammon, right? Remember again, boshes and pegam is not knas. Boshes and pegam is mammon. That's compensatory damages. So what about that? So the Gemara says, so we'll say, so that's the machlokes. So the Gemara says, ba abai. Sorry, ba mini abai merabo. So Abai asked Halakasha Rabba, Homer lechavero anasto upasita as biti v'hemaraticha bedin v'nischayavta li mamon. Okay, so we'll say a little bit of a wrinkle on the previous case. Shimon comes over to Reuven. Shimon says to Reuven, you went ahead and violated my daughter. I took you to Beis Din, and Beis Din found you guilty. So pay up. And what happens? V'hu omer, lo anasti v'lo pasiti v'lo amaritani bidin v'lo nischayavti l'cha mamon. And Reuven says, not true. I didn't violate your daughter. We never went to Beis Din, and I don't owe you anything. So v'nishba, And then Reuven swore that in fact he didn't do any of these things. And then Vahoda, now he admitted. Right? So now Reuven goes and admits, I lied. In other words, I did all of those things. I violated your daughter. We went to Beis Din. I was found guilty, and I owe you this money. Shabbos say, this is fascinating. So now, the Rabbi Shimon Mai. Shabbos say, Rabbi Shimon said in the previous case, if you remember what? That even when Reuven admits that he lied, and he swore falsely, Rabbi Shimon says that what's the halacha? He's pater. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon looks at this as a case of moda b'knas. He's admitting a fine. And moda b'knas pater. So Gemara says something fascinating. Rabbi says something fascinating. What about this case? Rabbi Shimon Mai. Kevan da'amad b'din mamona havi u'mechayiv alei karbon shvuah o doma afagav da'amad b'din knas havi. Rabbi said, listen to this fascinating question. See, in case number two, let's just see the two cases. In case number one, Shimon's confronting Reuven that he did something. Reuven is denying that he did it and swearing falsely. Then he's admitting that he did it. So he's admitting that he owes a knas. Rabbi Shimon says, okay, movda b'knas, pater, you're not chayiv anything. In case number two, what's happening over here? Reuven's confronting Shimon about two things. Number one, you violated my daughter. And number two, what? We went to Beis Din. And really, number three, Beis Din found you guilty, and you're chayiv. You're chayiv damages. So we'll say, this is a fascinating question. How do we view the verdict of Beis Din? Once Beis Din declares that Reuven is chayiv, right? So remember again, a case of violation. Let's go through this. What is Reuven going to be chayiv? So number one, knas. Next, tsar, boshas, pigam. So now that's all wrapped up into an award of Beis Din. So we'll say, listen to how fascinating this is. Once Beis Din awards the money, does the whole thing essentially become transformed into mammon? This is now a financial judgment. So we don't look at knas and mammon. It's mammon. It's now a financial judgment against Reuven. Or do we still look at it as knas as well? As knas and mammon wrapped up together. I'll say, you hear what this is? In other words, after there's a verdict of Beis Din, do we now just look at this as damages? This is mammon. This is what you owe. It's not. And after the verdict of Beis Din, right, Reuven, this is what you owe Shimon, and it's no different. So now let's say the award is $10,000. So now Beis Din declares, right, Reuven owes Shimon $10,000. So do we look at that $10,000 as no different as if Reuven had borrowed $10,000 from Shimon and he owes him money? So this is now mammon. And therefore, again, when Reuven goes in and admits that he lied, he's going to be chayiv what? Karen, all the financial award, plus an additional penalty fifth, and a asham gezelos. Or do we still look at the complete award as having a chilik of it that's knas? And if it's still knas, then what? Then when Reuven admits it, what's going to be the halacha? Modeh b'knas, pater. Such a fascinating, it's a fascinating discussion about how you look at Beis Din's financial award. Incredible. So we'll say, so Rava answered, because this was Abai asking of Rabba, sorry. Rabba answered, no. Once Beis Din passes a verdict, and now there's like a financial award, we look at that as mammon now and not knas, and therefore Reuven will be chayiv. So we'll say, Rabbi Shimon raised the kasha, Esvei, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Yochol ha'omer lechavera anastu upasitas biti. So we'll say, let's say again, Shimon goes over to Reuven, you seduced or violated my daughter. V'hu Omer, first white line about say, V'hu Omer, lo anasti, v'lo pasiti. Not true, never happened. Or, Hemis sharcha es avdi. Or Reuven goes over to Shimon. Shimon, your ox killed my eved. V'hu Omer lo hemis. Reuven says, never happened. Osha Omer lo. Avdo hipalta as, Osha Omer lo avdo. Hipalta as sheni. Visimisa es enai. Right? Or, this is an interesting case. We'll say, what's the halacha? If you go out and you knock out the eye of your eved, or you knock out the tooth of your eved, what's the halacha? Your eved goes free. So now your eved comes over to you and says, you knocked out my eye, you knocked out my tooth. V'hu omer lo hipalti v'lo samisi. And ultimately, again, the master says, never happened. V'nishpa. Now we'll say in all of these cases, we'll call him the defendant. The defendant swore that he did not do these things. V'hoda. And then he admitted that he lied. So we'll say in all of these, a lot of different cases over here. He admitted that he lied. What's the halacha? Yochel yehei chayiv. You might have thought that he should be chayiv Talmud lomar v'kichesh ba'amito b'pikadon o b'tshomes yad o b'gezel o ezek es amiso o matzah aveda v'kichesh ba v'nishba al sheker. Shabbos, listen to this. So the Torah over here is talking about the halacha, about if a person swears falsely. So it's interesting, I will say. So if you look at the cases of the Torah says as follows. The Torah says, right, v'kichesh ba'amito, you go ahead and you lie to your fellow, b'pikadon, regarding something deposited with you, o b'tshomes yad, something placed in your hand, o b'gezel, or with theft, o esek, o esamiso, or you wronged your fellow, o matzah aveda v'kichesh ba, or you found the lost object and you denied it, v'nishba al sheker, and then all of these cases you swore falsely. What's the common denominator amongst all these items mentioned in the pasuk? Ma'elu miyuchadin shein mamon, af kol shein mamon. They will say, when is there liability for swearing falsely about something? Only when what you're swearing falsely about is mamon, is money, as opposed to what? As opposed to what? Kinas. So yatsu elu shein kinas. So I will say, ultimately again, when is there a chiyuv for Hashem gzelos? Right? When is there a chiyuv for the carbon Hashem gzelos, for swearing falsely? For the Karen and for the Chomesh, only if you're swearing falsely about Mammon. But if you're swearing falsely about Knas, there is none of this liability. Amud Beis, my lab, Bisha Amad Bidin. So by the way, that has not introduced anything new to us. Jose, I just want to point out, we have two different, so remember, what we're working on right now is as follows. We introduced a new question here. Everyone is agreeing that halacha l'maisa, I shouldn't say everyone is agreeing, that's not true. Rabbi Shimon is saying that halacha l'maisa, if you went ahead and you swore falsely regarding knas, you're going to be pater. You're going to be pater. Right? So remember again, that's case number one. Case number one is Reuben comes over to Shimon. Shimon, you violated my daughter. Right? Shimon says, no, I didn't. Reuben says, swear. Sorry. Shimon comes over to Reuben. Reuben, you violated my daughter. Right? Reuben says, no, I didn't. Shimon says, swear. Reuben says, I swear. And then what happens? Reuben admits that he did it. What does Rabbi Shimon say? Pater. Now again, the Rabbanan disagree, but Rabbi Shimon says pater. Why does Rabbi Shimon say pater? Why? Because halacha l'maisa, what is Shimon admitting to? Sorry, keep going. What is Reuben admitting to? What is he admitting to? Knas. Now granted, there's also mammon in there, right? That's what the Rabbanan push back. I'm according to Rabbi Shimon, he's admitting to Knas. L'mod b'knas pater. And therefore, again, you're not chayiv on anything. You're not chayiv on the knas, you're not chayiv on the carbon, you're not chayiv on the carry, you're not chayiv on the chomesh, you're not chayiv on anything. Now, Bosig Gemara says, fine. What about case number 2, where Shimon confronts Reuben with the same claim, you violated my daughter, but we went to Beis Din. Beis Din found you guilty. Right? And Reuben says, never happened. Right? I swear, never happened. Turns out Reuben says, no, I admit, I did all of these things. So now they're asking Rabbi Shimon, how do you view Knas after Beis Din has awarded the money to the plaintiff? Do we still view that money as Knas? Or no, once it's part of a judicial adjudication, in other words, once it's part of an award that Beis Din has ordered, that's transformed into Mammon. That's transferred, and even Rabbi Shimon would agree that in that case, Reuben would be ordered to pay. So now, the Gemara brings down this case. When are you going to be chayiv ultimately again for swearing falsely? That's only in the case of Mammon, but not in Knas. What case of Knas will you be pater? Says the Gemara, my lab b'sha'amad b'din. Aren't we even talking about a case where Beis Din delivered the verdict already? And we see that even after the verdict, Knas money is still considered to be Knas. Lo, b'shalo amad b'din. No, not necessarily. In other words, we could be talking about, again, where a person is denying and then admitting to Knas, ultimately before a verdict. But perhaps after the verdict was delivered, right, if you go ahead and you deny that you owe that money, perhaps that's not called denial of Knas, or admittance of Knas afterwards, but rather, again, that's Mammon. To which the Gemara says, but since the Reisha is talking about a case where they already had, Beis Din already made a decision, Amad B'din, so the Seifa also has to be talking about Amad B'din, Diktani Reisha, because what do we say in the Reisha? Ultimately, I only know about things that you have to pay the principal. Ultimately, I don't know that it even includes things like kefel, arba v'chamisha. So we'll say these are all penalty payments. Ones mefata moti shemra, tamalomar uma'ala ma'al riba. So therefore we'll say the pasuk is ma'ala ma'al. That comes to include these cases as well. Now what does it mean? How are you coming to include cases of kinas? Hechidami. Idalo amad bedin kfela mi'ika. Now we'll say, now there's no such thing as kefel without a din Torah. In other words, kefel is the result of a verdict. So the Gemara says, "Ela pshita b'sha'amad bedin." Rather, it must be talking about a case where this particular case was already decided on by Beis Din. Umidereisha b'sha'amad bedin. And if the first part of the Mishnah is going to be, or the first part of the Brayso is going to be talking about amad bedin, seifa nami b'sha'amad bedin. Then the seifa must also be talking about amad bedin, where Beis Din already reached a verdict. And therefore, I will say it would appear that even after Beis Din reaches a verdict, halacha l'maisa, a knas is not called mamon. A knas is still called knas. Still called knas. Amarlei, yachim l'shanuy l'chareisha b'sha'amad bedin v'seifa b'shla amad bedin. So he said the truth is, I could answer this up, and I could explain to you how the Reisha is talking about a case where they did not yet have the din Torah, and the Seifa is talking about a case where they did have the din Torah. The Kula Rabbi Shimon, and I can establish the entire Brayso as according to Rabbi Shimon. But I don't want to give you a stretch answer. In other words, I don't want to give you an answer that's a bit dachuk, an answer that's a bit stretched. The imkain amartali, because you can always answer back to me. Listni Reisha Rabbi Shimon Omer, or listni Seifa Div Rabbi Shimon. Because if indeed that the entire Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon, then ultimately again the Mishnah should be introduced by saying Rabbi Shimon Omer, or the Mishnah should end with the words Divrei Rabbi Shimon. Ela kula b'sha'amad bedin. Rather, you have to say that the entire Mishnah is talking about a case where Beis Din already decided. Beis Din already made their psak halacha. V'reish Rabbanan v'seifa Rabbi Shimon. And the first case has to be talking about the Rabbanan, and the first case reflects the view of the Rabbanan, and the second case reflects the view of the Seifa, reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon. Umodina lacha. And I will admit to you that halacha l'maisa, that I will admit to you what? I'll admit to you that knas, after a psak Beis Din, is transformed into mamon. I'll admit to you, modina lecha le'inyan karban shavua, derachmana patre mivikichesh, v'chi ka'aminan mamon havi lahorisha lebanav. Wow. So I will say, this is actually quite fascinating. So we'll say, let's take a step back over for just a moment. What are we trying to focus on over here? Right? What are we trying to focus on? We're focusing, now we have a lot of stuff going on. First of all, we have a general machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan. Right? What's the general machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan? General machlokes. So the general machlokes really goes back to the first case. The first case was, again, Shimon comes over to Reuven, confronts Reuven. You violated my daughter. Reuven says, no, I didn't. Shimon says, swear. Reuven says, I swear I didn't. Then what happens? Reuven says, I lied. I did it. Rabbanan say, what's Reuven's liability? What's Reuven's liability? Tsar, Boshes, Pegam, Kinas, Chomesh, penalty fifth, Asham Gzelos. Rabbi Shimon, what does Rabbi Shimon say? Pater. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon says, there's a Kinas. He admitted that he owes a Kinas. Moda b'Kinas Pater. So we'll say, now Rabbi Shimon says he's Pater on everything. So the first machlokes, which we have not resolved, the first machlokes is, Rabbi Shimon allows the Kinas to almost like eclipse all of the other monetary payments. So according to Rabbi Shimon looks at this whole thing as Kinas, whereas the Rabbanan say, I don't understand. There's Moan and Kinas. Even if you want to exempt them on the Kinas, right? Even if he doesn't pay the Kinas, why shouldn't he have to pay Tsar, Boshes, Pigam, maybe the penalty fifth, the Asham Gzelos? So that's first machlokes. Right there, Rabbi Shimon ultimately is viewing this whole thing as a Kinas. The Rabbanan are viewing it as a combination of Mamon and Kinas. What's the second machlokes? The second machlokes, I will say, is how, or the second point of contention, we'll call it, is after Beis Din delivers a verdict, right? So now let's say again, I will say, Reuven goes ahead. Reuven violated Rachel, right? The case goes. Shimon the father brings the case to Beis Din. Beis Din rules in favor of Rachel. So now they say, Rachel, you are entitled to Kinas, Tsar, Boshes Pigam. Let's call it $10,000. $10,000. Beis Din says, Reuven, we hereby order you to pay Rachel $10,000. So we'll say, what's the shaila? What's the shaila? How do you view the $10,000? Is the $10,000, is that still called knas and mammon? Or maybe no, after the verdict of Beis Din, what is that called? What is that called? Mammon. Now we'll say, why does that matter? That matters again because remember case number 2 is where once again Shimon confronts Reuven and says to Reuven, you violated my daughter. And we went to Beis Din and you're chayiv $10,000 to me. And what does Reuven say? Not true, on all counts. Reuven swears to that he's not chayiv at all. And then it turns out that what? Reuven lied. Reuven lied. So now, halacha lemaisa, do we view Reuven as denying a knas, in which case he's pater, or the whole thing is mammon? So the Gemara just ended off for us with an interesting distinction. It could very well be that legabe karban, in terms of karban, maybe we still look at this as knas, and therefore you won't be chayiv a karban or chomesh. But maybe in terms of ultimately, again, mammon, in terms of laws of inheritance, it's looked at as mammon. It's looked at as mammon. Look at Rashi. Lahorisha lebanav misha amad bedin umeis achlo hispik ligbos hare yishalacha velo shala. I will say maybe we look at this financial amount, this bucket, this entire bucket, as mammon, and therefore again halacha lemaisa, if the father were to die before the verdict were to be delivered, right? In accordance with the Rabbanon and the Mishnah, this entire bucket of money would pass through to the brothers because we view the whole thing as mammon. In other words, maybe we view it as mammon for certain things, but not mammon as other things. Eisir Shimon Omer, Imlo speak a ligbos achem sa'av harein shalatzma. So we'll say this is the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah, right? Rabbi Shimon says if she did not have the opportunity, I should say, to go ahead and if the money was not collected by the father before the father died, harein hein shalatzma. Rabbi says Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, right? Rabbi Shimon says the money does not become the property of the father until he collects it. Therefore, if the father dies before collection, the money becomes the property of the girl. So the Gemara says, "Fi armet mammon havi la rishon labanav liatzma amai da'achin by mihavi." But if it's just said before that maybe this money could be considered mammon for inheritance purposes, if that's the case, then why does the girl get it? Why wouldn't the brothers inherit? In other words, as long as the father is alive at the beginning of the proceedings, then this bucket of money should be called mammon at least for inheritance purposes, and let her brothers inherit it, not her. Rava said, "Hai milsa kashay ba Rabbi Rav Yosef Esrin v'tartin shner." This is incredible. Rabbi says this matter was a kasha, was difficult for Rabbi and Rav Yosef for 22 years. V'lo ifrik, and they never were able to answer it. Ad Yosef Rav Yosef bereisha opirka, until Rav Yosef came and was Rosh Yeshiva and ultimately answered. Rabbi said, take a look at Rashi. It's actually an incredible Rashi. Esrin v'tartin shnin. It's right across in Tosfos low. Listen to this. Hein hayu yimei srarasol shal Rabba. Rabba was Rosh Yeshiva for 22 years. Umeis, and then he died. The Yasha Rav Yosef Barosh. When Rav Yosef was made Rosh Yeshiva, Rabba, listen to this. V'sayua min hashamayim lefarki lios lo l'shem l'fishay Rabba charif v'lakach karu oker haran. Listen to this. When Rav Yosef became the Rosh Yeshiva, this is incredible. People didn't know if he was really up for the task. Because Rabba was Rabba. And Rav Yosef came along, and people were like, okay. So we'll say, so what happened? A miracle occurred. Rav Yosef had certain siyata d'shmaya that on his first day on the job as Rosh Yeshiva, he was able to resolve certain halachic issues which were outstanding for over 2 decades. And Rav Yosef, this is one of them. On the first day of the job, he resolved this question that was outstanding for 22 years. She's supposed to look at the end of Rashi. Rashi says, over lakach karu oker harim. We'll say Rabbah was called an Oker Harim. Oker Harim means what? An uprooter of mountains. And we'll say Oker Harim, that term is used for someone with an incredibly, a deep intellect. Someone who's able to look at things critically and ask profound questions. And really, Oker Harim means someone who possesses a keen power of analysis. That was Rabbah. Rav Yosef was not an Oker Harim. What does Rav Yosef? Let's look at Rashi. Rav Yosef haya bal shmuos u'mishna braisa. Let's say Rav Yosef was an encyclopedia, and therefore what? Lakach karua Sinai. They called him Sinai. I will say Sinai is the term that's used for someone who possesses a voluminous amount of knowledge. We'll have to stop over here for today. So I'll stop over here. I'm going to leave you on the cliffhanger with the question. I'll just point out that people had doubts about Rav Yosef because he wasn't a Sinai. He wasn't an Okrama, he was a Sinai. Therefore, he has Siyata D'Shmaya on the first day of the job. The Kadosh Baruch Hu allowed him to go ahead and resolve certain issues which were outstanding for over 2 decades. We'll say the resolution in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chevra, have a great day, everyone.